Borgia Pope, power, scandal, and the shadow within the church. He wore the robes of the Vicar of Christ, but behind the crimson veil lay whispers of seduction, corruption, and blood. Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, a name that still echoes through the marble halls of the Vatican like a ghost. To some, he was a patron of the arts, a brilliant strategist, but to many, he was the embodiment of everything the church was never meant to be. Affairs, assassinations, nepotism, and a family dynasty more feared than loved, the Borgias. But who was the real Alexander VI? Was he a monster in papal robes, or a man caught between divine power and human temptation? In this episode, we peel back the gold and crimson and uncover the darkest reign in papal history. This is not just a scandal, it's a mirror, reflecting how fragile power can be, even in the house of God. The origins of Rodrigo Borgia. Noble blood or political trap? In the dusty corners of 15th century Spain, long before the papal crown would rest on his head, a boy named Rodrigo Borgia was born, into privilege, ambition, and whispers of destiny. His family was not ordinary. The Borgias were of noble blood, Spanish aristocracy with connections stretching across Europe. Yet, they weren't known just for nobility. They were feared, admired, envied. The Borgia name carried weight and scandal. Rodrigo's uncle, Alfonso Borgia, would become Pope Calixtus III. This opened the door of the Vatican for Rodrigo, not as a humble servant of God, but as a young man with a map to the center of power. At just 25, he was made a cardinal. At 27, he became vice-chancellor of the church, the second most powerful office in the Roman Curia. But the question lingers: did Rodrigo rise by virtue or by design? He was brilliant, undeniably. Charismatic, educated in law, fluent in Latin, and skilled in rhetoric, Rodrigo was everything a Renaissance church craved on paper. But beneath the surface, darker tales brewed. Some say he had children. Others say he flaunted them. Some claim he used the confessional not for forgiveness, but for manipulation, and yet he remained protected, even promoted. Was it because of his talents, or because the church itself had begun to blur the lines between divine mission and political empire? Rodrigo Borgia thrived in a system that rewarded influence more than integrity. He navigated the intricate politics of Rome like a seasoned chess master, strategic, calculating, always 3 moves ahead. He made friends in high places and enemies in higher ones. But let's pause here. Before we cast judgment, before we label him as the devil in red robes, consider this. Was Rodrigo Borgia a product of a corrupt church or a symbol of it? Was he a young man trapped in a game where everyone was playing dirty, and he just played better? History has not been kind to him. Neither have the myths. Writers, artists, and modern media have turned his name into shorthand for ecclesiastical sin. But how much of it is truth, and how much carefully planted legend? The church in the 1400s was not the church we know today. It was a battlefield of ambition, where kings bowed to popes, and popes answered to no one but God, or so they claimed. Power was not only spiritual, it was political, military, economic. In that world, the Vatican was not just a sanctuary, it was a throne room. And into that throne room stepped Rodrigo Borgia. So who was he really? A visionary? A villain? A victim of history? The answers are hidden between facts and fiction, in the cracks of chronicles and confessions. But one thing is certain. The rise of Rodrigo Borgia was not accidental. It was crafted, step by step, in full view of the world, yet cloaked in secrecy. This was no ordinary priest. This was the man who would become Pope Alexander VI, And the real story is just beginning. But if Rodrigo Borgia's rise through the church was already a masterclass in ambition, what happened next would redefine the papacy itself. Because in 1492, the world would witness one of the most controversial papal elections in history. Was it divine appointment or the Vatican's biggest political deal? In part 2, we open the doors of the conclave and step into the smoke, the secrets, and the scandal behind the making of Pope Alexander VI. Smoke and silver. Was Alexander VI chosen by God or bought by gold? Rome, 1492. A city simmering with tension and ambition. Pope Innocent VIII had passed, and with his death came a vacuum of power so vast it stirred not just prayers, but political storms. In the heart of the Vatican, a conclave was called. 23 cardinals gathered in solemn secrecy, but the world outside suspected this was no sacred ritual. This was the church's ultimate chess match. Among the players stood Rodrigo Borgia, no longer just the vice-chancellor or a Spanish cardinal. He was now the contender. Rodrigo was seasoned. He'd served under multiple popes, mastered the mechanics of Rome, and held deep relationships across noble houses. But it wasn't just experience that made him dangerous. It was his network and his wealth. Rumors whispered through the marble corridors of the Vatican that gold had exchanged hands, that bishoprics had been promised, that alliances were not forged in prayer, but in secret meetings behind velvet curtains. Did Borgia buy his way to the papacy? It's tempting to say yes. Records suggest that Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, originally a rival, suddenly changed his vote, later receiving the coveted post of vice-chancellor. Other cardinals who supported Borgia allegedly found themselves rewarded with lands, titles, and influence. And yet, here's where the mystery deepens. When the white smoke rose and the bells of St. Peter's rang out, the crowds didn't riot. They cheered. Roman citizens, tired of papal weakness and internal corruption, welcomed Alexander VI with open arms. In him, they saw strength, leadership, and a return to papal authority. Could it be that the people, more than the cardinals, recognized something Rome desperately needed? Still, the accusations didn't stop. The word simony, selling spiritual offices, hung heavy. Even Borgia's fiercest enemies, like Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, who would one day become Pope Julius II, called his election a scandal. But here's the catch. Much of the damning evidence against Alexander VI emerged after his death, penned by those who lost power under his reign. So again, we ask, was he a corrupt manipulator, or simply a man who understood how the game was played? Let's not forget, Renaissance Europe was a stage of power plays where kings and popes bartered like merchants. The church, for all its divine language, was also a political beast. Rodrigo Borgia didn't corrupt the system. He navigated it, and he did so with startling precision. As Pope, Alexander VI moved fast. He installed loyalists, restructured Vatican finances, and tightened his grip on the papal states. He didn't come to preach, he came to rule. But with power came suspicion. He was no monk. He fathered children. He held lavish banquets. He moved like a prince, not a pastor. And yet, beneath the luxury was a cold strategy. Every action had purpose. Every appointment, every alliance, every enemy neutralized was part of a larger design. Was it divine strategy or human cunning? Was he truly God's anointed or history's most audacious opportunist? In the next section, we step beyond the robes and rings into a world of seduction, betrayal, and whispered sins. The Vatican would never look the same again. Welcome to the Borgia Court. The Shadow Court. Scandal or strategy? Behind the gilded doors of the Vatican, a new court was rising. But this was no court of saints. It was a court of whispers, wealth, and whispers of sin. Welcome to the Borgia era. As Pope Alexander VI settled into power, the papacy began to look less like a divine office and more like a royal dynasty. But was that by accident or by design? The first shock came not from a decree, but from the Pope's personal life. Rodrigo Borgia had children, not spiritual sons and daughters, but biological ones. Among them were Lucrezia and Cesare Borgia, names that would one day become legends of both brilliance and infamy. Some say Lucrezia was the pawn of her father's ambitions. Others say she was far more dangerous, educated, politically astute, and willing to do whatever it took to survive the Vatican's treacherous world. Cesare, meanwhile, was no mere priest. He would become a cardinal, a general, and, some whispered, a killer in robes. But was this scandal or strategy? Alexander VI broke precedent by openly advancing his children's power. He appointed Cesare as cardinal at a young age, arranged Lucrezia's political marriages to form alliances, and placed Borgia allies in key positions throughout Italy. The papacy became a chessboard, and his family, the queen, knight, and rook. Critics howled. How could the vicar of Christ raise a family like a king and promote blood ties within holy offices? But again, the question must be asked. Was Alexander simply reflecting the politics of his age, or rewriting the rules to consolidate control? Let's not forget, the Italy of the 15th century was a mosaic of city-states, constantly at war, constantly shifting alliances. The papacy wasn't just a spiritual seat, it was a political player, and Alexander VI played the game better than most monarchs. But even that couldn't shield him from the growing rumors. Tales began to spread of masked banquets inside the Vatican, of orgies attended by bishops, of bribes exchanged under candlelight. One particularly infamous tale was the Banquet of the Chestnuts, a night of food, drink, and debauchery involving courtesans and clergy. Many historians doubt its authenticity. Others swear it happened, but the very fact that such a story could survive centuries tells us something about the shadow he cast. So we face the same riddle again. Was this a man driven by lust or by legacy? Alexander's reign was not only marked by scandal, but also surprising effectiveness. He restructured Vatican finances, expanded political influence, and stabilized the Papal States. He negotiated with France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire like a seasoned statesman. Some even credit him with strengthening the papacy's temporal power. But history doesn't always reward strategy. It remembers scandal. Paintings depict him as corpulent and smug. Plays cast him as a villain. Novels portray him as the embodiment of church corruption. But peel back the layers, and we see something more complex. A man shaped by the brutal world around him. Father using power to protect his blood. A pope who blurred the line between salvation and survival. But what if the most outrageous tales about Alexander VI were planted, not proven? In Part 4, we'll uncover how myth, politics, and enemies shaped the legend of the most evil pope in history. Could the real scandal be the way we remember him? Myth or memory? The making of a legend. By now, you've heard the rumors, the orgies, the murders, the whispers of poison-laced wine. The Vatican turned into a palace of sin. But pause for a moment and ask, who told these stories and why? History has a strange habit. It remembers what's written, not always what's true. And when it comes to Pope Alexander VI, the lines between fact and legend blur more than almost any figure in papal history. Many of the most damning accounts of Alexander's life came not from his lifetime, but from those who followed, from political enemies, from reformers, from chroniclers with motives that went far beyond truth. Take, for example, the infamous Banquet of the Chestnuts, An alleged orgy involving courtesans and clergy, it has become synonymous with Borgia corruption. But the only known source for the story comes from Johannes Burchard, the Pope's own master of ceremonies, years after the event supposedly happened. And even his manuscript raises doubts. Was it a first-hand account, or hearsay crafted for shock? It gets murkier. Cesare Borgia, the Pope's son, was often painted as a ruthless killer, a Machiavellian monster in red robes. Lucrezia was portrayed as a seductress, even rumored to be romantically involved with her own father. But much of this came from Renaissance-era gossip, repeated, recycled, reimagined, until it hardened into legend. So, what if the scandal we've inherited is actually a narrative? Think about it. What better way to weaken the Borgia legacy than to turn it into a cautionary tale? What better way to pave the way for reform than to highlight one man's sins as symbolic of the Church's decay? Even Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer, used Alexander VI as an example of everything wrong with Rome. Whether the tales were true or not didn't matter. The image had been forged. But here's the twist. Not everything about Alexander's papacy was depraved. He expanded the Papal States. He engaged in complex diplomacy with France and Spain. He supported art, architecture, and administrative reform. The Church, under his control, became politically stronger, even if morally so questionable. It's easy to demonize a man when his face is already drawn with horns. But what if we peeled that mask off? What if Alexander VI wasn't a villain, but a mirror? A reflection of a church caught between holiness and human weakness, between divine calling and worldly ambition? In a time when popes wielded swords as well as scriptures, perhaps he was not the exception, but the rule laid bare. Or maybe that's exactly what they want us to believe. Was his legacy distorted by enemies? Was it shaped by artists, playwrights, and historians who needed a villain for their drama? And here's the hardest question of all. Do we remember Alexander VI because of who he was, or because of the story they wanted us to believe? In our final chapter, we follow the last days of Pope Alexander VI, his mysterious death, the fall of the Borgia name, and the legacy that refuses to die. Was his fate divine justice, or history's greatest misunderstanding? The fall, death, legacy, and the church that endures. By 1503, the reign of Pope Alexander VI was beginning to unravel. The alliances were weakening, the enemies emboldened, and the scandals, they never stopped echoing. The man who once ruled the Vatican like a king now found himself surrounded by uncertainty, even fear. His son, Cesare Borgia, had lost his grip on the territories they had fought to control. The Borgia name, once synonymous with power, had become a curse whispered in courtly circles. And then, as suddenly as he had risen, Alexander VI died. Some said it was fever, others, poison. There were whispers that the poison meant for someone else had accidentally found its way into his own cup. But there were no dramatic speeches, no angelic visions, only death. His body, swollen, blackened, and reportedly decomposing at an unnatural rate, was buried with little fanfare. The grandeur of his life stood in stark contrast to the quiet horror of his death. Was it divine justice? Was it karma? Or simply the final chapter of a man who flew too close to power? Whatever it was, the world moved on. The papal court shifted. The Borgia crest was removed from tapestries. Within a few short years, Cesare was exiled. Lucrezia faded into obscurity. The dynasty collapsed. The name Borgia became legend, but never again reality. And yet, the church remained. This is perhaps the most astonishing truth in this story, that the chair of Peter, battered by scandal, occupied by flawed men, and surrounded by corruption, did not fall. That the church Jesus Christ established on the rock of Peter outlived Rodrigo Borgia. He ruled the Vatican for 11 years. Christ has ruled it for over 2,000. Alexander VI did not destroy the church. No one ever has. No one ever will. Throughout history, popes have risen and fallen, some saints, some sinners. But the promise of Jesus remains. The gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Matthew 16:18. In the end, the story of Pope Alexander VI is not just about corruption. It is about resilience. It is about a church that outlives empires, a faith that survives betrayal, a truth that withstands centuries of darkness. And maybe that's the real miracle. Not that popes are perfect, but that the church, through every storm, still carries the light. History may divide opinions, but truth invites reflection. What do you believe about Pope Alexander VI? Was he a product of his time, or something darker? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if this journey stirred something in you, like, share, and subscribe to ANO Productions, because the past still speaks, and we're here to uncover what it's trying to say.